I sat in my living room, my 3-week-old daughter sleeping against my chest, when the email arrived. The subject line was corporate neutral. Benefits update, important information. My hands were still shaky from exhaustion and hormones as I opened it. The message was sterile, bureaucratic, designed to obscure its cruelty behind professional language. Due to recent budget adjustments, your health insurance coverage has been paused indefinitely, effective immediately. This decision reflects our commitment to fiscal responsibility during challenging economic times. I read it 3 times before the words actually penetrated. Paused indefinitely. My health insurance. While I was on maternity leave. While I had a newborn whose hospital bills were due next week. The sender wasn't HR. It was a direct message from Calvin Reese, my boss. He'd made this decision personally. My daughter stirred against me, making small whimpering sounds. I held her closer, feeling the weight of her tiny body, the vulnerability of her existence. The hospital bill sitting on my desk was $14,000. My husband's insurance wouldn't cover it. We'd relied on mine for the pregnancy. He really thinks he can get away with this, I whispered. Right then, something hardened inside me. A decision. Promise. He would never have this kind of power over me again. I called Calvin the next morning, keeping my voice steady despite the rage burning in my chest. My daughter was in her bassinet beside me, sleeping peacefully, unaware that her mother was about to confront the man who just made our lives infinitely harder. Tessa, how's motherhood treating you? His voice was too cheerful, too casual, like he hadn't just stripped away my family's healthcare. I received the email about my insurance. Ah yes, unfortunate timing but necessary. We're making tough choices across the board. He paused. Between you and me, a woman in your situation might want to reconsider her workload anyway. Focus on family. Maybe transition to part-time when you return. The condescension was breathtaking. A woman in your situation. As if having a child made me less capable. Less valuable. I see, I said quietly. Glad you understand. These decisions aren't personal, Tessa. Just business. I hung up and sat there trembling. Not from fear. From clarity. The kind that comes when someone shows you exactly who they are. I walked to my home office and opened the filing cabinet. Inside was a folder I hadn't touched in months. My father's old investment portfolio. The trust account he'd left me. I pulled it out and started reading. 3 years earlier my father had died suddenly. Heart attack. He was only 62. At his funeral, his lawyer had handed me an envelope. Inside was a letter in my father's handwriting. Tessa, don't waste this. Build something of your own. Security isn't a job, it's ownership. Be smart. The inheritance was modest. $60,000. Not enough to retire on, but enough to invest wisely. My father had always been interested in our company. He'd researched it, knew its trajectory. That company you work for, he'd told me once. It's undervalued. Management's weak, but the fundamentals are solid. If I were younger, I'd buy in. So I'd honored his advice. Used my maiden name, Tessa Morrison instead of Tessa Kent, to set up a trust. Bought shares quietly through a financial advisor my father had recommended. Started with 5% ownership. Over 3 years, I'd reinvested dividends. Bought during dips, accumulated slowly. It was supposed to be my safety net. My retirement fund. My insurance against exactly the kind of situation I was now facing. I'd never imagined it might become something else. Something bigger. Leverage. While I was at home recovering, the company's inner circle was busy. I knew this because I still had access to the company's shared calendar. I could see the meetings. The private discussions Calvin was scheduling. One meeting title caught my attention. Leadership Transition Planning. I called my friend Keisha, who still worked in the office. What's happening with the leadership transition? Girl, you didn't hear. Calvin's basically guaranteed the CO position. He's been strutting around like he already has it. Why? He's been cutting costs like crazy. Convinced the board he's a financial genius. Cancelled insurance for you and 2 other people on leave. Pushed out 3 senior employees by making their jobs impossible. The board thinks he's brilliant. My stomach turned. He cancelled insurance for others too. Yeah. Marcus in accounting and Sylvia in sales. Both out on medical leave. He called it eliminating redundant coverage costs. After I hung up, I sat in silence. This wasn't just about me. Calvin was systematically hurting people to boost his own career. Using our pain as proof of his leadership. I opened my laptop and logged into my trust account. Time to see exactly what I had. The hospital bill arrived 2 days later. $14,347. Due in 30 days. I stared at the number until it blurred. My husband's salary was good, but we'd budgeted based on 2 incomes. Based on having insurance. $14,000 would wipe out most of our emergency fund. The humiliation was crushing. I'd worked at that company for 6 years. Given them everything. Stayed late. Took on extra projects. Mentored junior employees. And this was how they repaid loyalty. But as I held that bill, something shifted. The pain transformed into something harder. Clearer. No emotional outburst. No confrontation. No complaints. Just strategy. I called my financial advisor. The one my father had recommended. The one who managed my trust. Tessa, good to hear from you. How's the baby? Beautiful. But I need to talk about my portfolio. How much do I actually own? Let me pull up your account. Heard typing. Then a low whistle. With the reinvestments and the additional purchases we made last quarter. You're at 32% of the company's outstanding shares. 32%. I'd known it was substantial, but hearing the number said aloud made it real. Who else owns significant shares? The largest shareholder is an investment fund that backs Calvin Reese. They own 35%. I was 3% away from matching Calvin's biggest supporter. My advisor continued, his voice thoughtful. Tessa, you realize what this means. You're one of the largest individual shareholders. If you kept buying, I could own the company he thinks he runs. Theoretically, yes. But that would require significant capital. More than you currently have liquid. What if I used my home equity? Or took out a loan against my current shares? Silence. Then, that's risky. If the company's value dropped, you could lose everything. I thought about Calvin's voice on the phone. A woman in your situation. I thought about the hospital bill. About 3 other people he'd hurt the same way. Set up a meeting. I want to explore options. That night, I lay awake while my husband slept and my daughter dozed in her bassinet. The numbers ran through my head. 32%. 35%. 3%. The gap between being powerless and having control. I'd spent my whole career being the good employee. Following rules. Being grateful for opportunities. Accepting whatever was given. Maybe it was time to take instead. I sat in my living room 6 weeks later with surreal. Daughter sleeping against my chest. Everyone greeted me with tight smiles and careful words. The subject line was corporate neutral that barely hides pity. Update. Calvin summoned me to his office the first day. My hands were still shaky from exhaustion and hormones as I opened it. Well, your message was sterile, which is completely understandable. Designed to obscure its cruelty behind professional language. I've made some adjustments to your workload. Due to recent budget adjustments, you to a your health insurance coverage has been paused indefinitely. Just temporary, of course. Immediately. And I'm assigning you some catch-up projects. This decision reflects our commitment to fiscal responsibility during challenging economic for someone getting back into the rhythm. I read it 3 times before the words actually penetrated. The catch-up projects were tasks my health insurance usually handled. While I was on maternity leave. Every detail was designed while I had a newborn whose hospital bills were due next week. That sounds fine. The sender wasn't HR. As I was leaving his office, message from Calvin Reese, my boss, on his desk. He'd made confidential this decision personally. My daughter stirred against me, making small whimpering sounds. Calvin called out. I held her closer. Could you grab me a coffee? The weight of her tiny body, 2 sugars, the vulnerability of her existence. While he was distracted on sitting on my desk was $14,000. I pulled out my phone and snapped a quick photo of the report's cover page and the visible paragraphs underneath. We'd relied on mine for the pregnancy. Of course. I replied.
He really
already
thinks he
planning
can get
my
away
next
with
move.
this.
That night I studied the photo.
Something hardened
the visible
inside
portions
me.
of Calvin's report were damning.
Promise.
References
He would never have
to
this kind of
unpaid
power
overtime
over me again.
compliance exemptions.
I called Calvin the next
Notes
morning
about
keeping my voice steady
despite
despite
the
the
rage burning in my chest.
My daughter was in her
termination
bassinet beside
protocols
me,
for extended
sleeping
leave.
peacefully.
This wasn't
Unaware
just
that her
me.
mother was about
This
to
was
confront the man
systematic.
who just made
Calvin
our lives
had been cutting
infinitely
costs
harder.
by exploiting
Tessa,
people who couldn't
how's
fight
motherhood
back.
treating
People
you?
on medical
His voice
leave.
was too cheerful,
People with
too
sick
casual.
family members.
Like he hadn't
People
just
he
stripped
considered
away my
disposable.
family's health care.
I needed
I
the full
received
report,
the email
but
about
I
my
couldn't
insurance.
access it directly without
yes.
raising suspicion.
Unfortunate timing,
my
but
smaller
necessary.
office, my
We're
reduced
making tough
responsibilities
choices
across the
They
board.
were all designed to keep me away from
Between
important
you and me,
information.
a woman
So I'd
in
have
your
to get
situation
creative.
might want to
Over
reconsider
the next
her
week,
workload
I made
anyway.
myself useful.
Focus on family.
Volunteered to help
Maybe
with PR
transition to
materials.
part-time when you
Offered to
return.
assist with
the
internal
condescension
audits.
was breathtaking.
Smiled through
a
Calvin's
woman in your
condescension.
situation.
You're
As
being
if
a
having
real
a child
team
made
player,
me less
he
capable,
said one afternoon.
less valuable.
See,
This is the attitude
I said
that gets
quietly.
people ahead.
Glad you
Humble,
understand.
willing to do
These
the
decisions
unglamorous
aren't
work.
personal, Tessa.
Smiled back.
Just
I'm
business.
just happy to
I hung up and
contribute.
sat there,
He bought
trembling.
it completely,
Not from fear.
Started leaving
From clarity.
sensitive documents
The kind
on
that
his
comes
desk
when
I
someone
was
shows
around.
you exactly who
Started
they are.
speaking more
I walked
freely
to my
about
home
his
office
strategies
and opened the filing
and I started
cabinet.
collecting everything.
Inside was a folder
the breakthrough
I hadn't
came
touched
at a
in
company
months.
dinner. My
Calvin
father's
had
old
too much to
investment
drink
portfolio.
and started bragging
the
to a
trust
group of
account he'd
senior
left
managers.
me. I pulled
The
it out
key,
and started
he slurred,
reading.
is
3 years
understanding that
earlier, my
sentiment
father
is
had
expensive.
died suddenly.
These people
Heart
want
attack.
compassion.
He was
That's
only
not
62.
business.
You
At
met
his
the hard
funeral,
choices.
his
Document
lawyer
them
had
properly.
handed me an envelope.
And the board thinks you're
Inside
a genius.
was a letter
I
in my
nursed my
father's
water
handwriting.
and listened.
Tessa,
Take the
don't
insurance
waste this.
cuts.
Build
Saved us
something of your own.
$40,000 annually.
Security
and
isn't
it's
a job,
legal,
it's
technically.
ownership.
When
Be
someone's
smart.
on unpaid leave,
The inheritance
you can adjust
was
benefits.
modest. You just have to word it right.
Not
One
enough
of the
to retire
managers
on,
looked
but enough to
uncomfortable.
invest wisely.
Doesn't that hurt
My father
morale?
had always been
Who cares
interested in
about
our
morale?
company. Care
He'd
about
researched
margins,
it.
knew its trajectory.
That's what gets me promoted.
That company you work
He
for,
laughed.
he told
Plus,
me once.
I've been moving some
It's
of the savings
undervalued.
into performance
Management's
bonuses.
weak, but the
For
fundamentals are
executives who
solid.
make tough calls.
If I were younger,
My hand
I'd tightened
tightened
around my
so
glass.
I'd honored his
Performance
advice.
bonuses.
Used my
for
maiden
himself.
Tessa
Using
Morrison
money
instead
saved
of
from
Tessa
cutting
Kent
sick
to
people's
set up a
insurance.
trust.
Later
Bought
that
shares
night,
quietly
I
through a
documented
financial
everything he'd
advisor
said.
my father had recommended.
Witnesses
Started
direct
with
quotes.
5% ownership.
The next morning,
Over
I
3
started
years,
digging into
I'd
the company's
reinvested
financial
dividends.
disclosures.
Bought during dips.
There were
accumulated
irregularities.
slowly.
It was
Small
supposed
amounts
to be my
transferred
safety
to
net.
accounts I
My
didn't
retirement
recognize.
fund.
Calvin
My
wasn't
insurance
just
against
cruel.
exactly
He
the
was
kind of
stealing.
situation I was
I
now
spent
facing.
the next 2 weeks
I'd never
quietly
imagined it
collecting
might
evidence.
become something else.
Every irregularity
Something
in the
bigger.
books.
Leverage.
Every questionable
While I was
transfer.
at home recovering,
Every policy
the company's
that pushed
inner
legal
circle
boundaries.
was busy.
Then
I
my
knew this
advisor
because
called.
I still had
Tessa,
access
we've
to the
noticed
company's
something.
shared calendar.
There's an
I could
anonymous
see the
investor
meetings,
buying
the
shares.
private discussions Calvin
Significant
was
amounts.
scheduling. We've been
One
tracking
meeting
it
title
and
caught my attention.
we think it might be
Leadership
Calvin.
transition planning.
He's
I
buying
called my
shares
friend
too,
Keisha, who
through
still
a shell
worked in the
company.
office.
But the
What's
timing
happening
and
with the
amount
leadership
suggested
transition?
him.
Girl, you
He's
didn't
trying
hear.
to secure majority
Calvin's
control
basically
before the
guaranteed
board
the CO
election next
position.
month. It was a race
He's
now.
been strutting
Calvin
around
was
like
trying
he
to
already
consolidate
has it.
power.
Why?
He got to 51%
He's been
before I
cutting
did.
costs like crazy.
He'd have total control.
Convinced the board
Could
he's a
restructure the
financial
company.
genius.
Could make
Canceled
his position
insurance for
permanent.
you and 2 other
I
people
looked at
on
my
leave.
savings account.
Pushed out 3
at the home
senior
equity
employees
we'd
by
built.
making their jobs
At the shares I
impossible.
already owned.
The board thinks
I
he's
need a
brilliant.
loan.
I
My
told my
stomach
advisor.
turned. Against my
He
current
canceled
shares.
insurance for
Maximum
others too.
amount you
Yeah.
can secure.
Marcus in
Tessa,
accounting and
that's
Sylvia in
aggressive.
sales.
If anything
Both out
goes
on medical
wrong,
leave. Nothing's going to
he
go
called
wrong.
it eliminating
How much can I
redundant
get?
coverage
There was a
costs.
pause. After I
Enough
hung up,
to push
I
you
sat
close
in
to
silence.
45%.
This wasn't just
But
about
you'd be
me.
heavily leveraged.
Calvin was systematically
Do it.
hurting
The
people
loan
to
came
boost
through
his
in
own
3
career.
days. Using
used
our
every
pain
dollar
as
to
proof
buy
of
more
his
shares.
leadership.
I opened my
45%,
laptop and logged
46,
into my trust account.
47.
Time to see
Then I
exactly
discovered
what I
something
had.
else.
The hospital
board
bill
was
arrived
planning
2
to
days
vote on
later.
company maternity policies.
$14,347
Calvin had proposed eliminating paid due in
maternity
30 days
leave entirely.
I stared at the
Market
number
competitive
until it blurred.
adjustment.
My husband's
His
salary
proposal
was
called
good,
it.
but
The
we
vote was
budgeted
scheduled
based on
for the
two
next board
incomes.
meeting. Based
If
on
it
having
passed,
insurance,
every woman in the company would lose
14,000 would wipe
protection.
out
I
most
thought
of our
was
emergency
guaranteed.
fund.
I worked
The
late into the
humiliation
night.
was crushing.
My daughter
I'd
sleeping
worked
in
at
her
that
packing
company for
place
6
beside my
years.
desk,
Given
I
them
built
everything.
spreadsheets, stayed late,
tracked ownership
took on
percentages,
extra projects,
calculated what I'd need.
employees.
My husband
And this was
found
how
me
they
at 2 in the
repaid
morning.
loyalty.
Tessa,
But as
you
I
need
held that
sleep.
bill,
I
something
need to
shifted.
finish this.
The pain
What are you
transformed
doing?
into something
I
harder.
looked at him,
Clearer,
taking back
no emotional
control.
outburst.
But I need
no
you to trust me.
confrontation.
He
No
studied my
complaints.
face,
Just strategy.
saw something there that
called
made
my
him
financial
nod.
advisor.
Okay,
The
I
one my
trust
father
you.
had
The
recommended.
betrayal came
The
from
one
an
who managed my
unexpected
trust.
place.
Tessa,
I was in the
good
break
to hear
room,
from you.
heating up lunch,
How's the
when I
baby?
heard voices
Beautiful.
from around the corner.
But I need to
I
talk
can't
about my
believe
portfolio.
she came back.
How much
After
do I
Calvin
actually
basically
own?
told her she
Let me
wasn't
pull up
needed
your
anymore.
account.
She's
Heard
pulling
typing,
the sympathy
then
card.
a low whistle.
New mom,
With the
needs
reinvestments
special
and the
treatment.
additional purchases we made
pathetic.
last quarter.
Calvin told me
You're
she's
at
basically a
32% of the
liability
company's
now.
outstanding
Said
shares.
we shouldn't trust her with
32%.
important projects.
I'd known it was
I
substantial.
recognized the voices.
But hearing the number
Two
said
people
aloud
I'd considered
made it real.
work friends.
Who else
Two people
owns
I'd helped
significant
get promoted.
shares? The
My
largest
hands shook as I
shareholder
stirred
is
my
an
soup.
investment fund
But
that
I
backs
didn't
Calvin
confront
Rees.
them.
Didn't
They own
cry.
35%.
Didn't give them the reaction
I was
they
3%
expected.
away from
Instead,
matching
I pulled out
Calvin's
my
biggest
phone and
supporter.
texted my advisor.
My advisor
Pushed to
continued,
48%.
his voice thoughtful.
Whatever it takes.
Tessa, you realize
Then I went
what
back
this
to my
means.
closet office
You're
and
one
kept
of the
working,
largest
kept
individual
smiling,
shareholders.
kept
If
collecting
you kept
evidence.
buying,
That
I could
afternoon,
own
I
the company
discovered something
he
else.
thinks he runs.
One of those voices
Theoretically,
I'd heard.
yes. But
Marcus
that would
from
require
accounting
significant
had been
capital.
secretly recording
More than you
meetings for
currently
Calvin,
have liquid.
feeding him
What if I
information
used
about
my
who was
home
loyal
equity
and who wasn't,
or took out a
so
loan
that's how
against
Calvin
my current
always
shares.
stayed ahead.
Silence.
He had spies.
Then,
Well, now
that's
so did
risky.
I.
If
I
the
started
company's
building
value
my own
dropped,
network.
you could
Quietly,
lose everything.
Carefully,
I thought about
First
Calvin's
was Patricia
voice on the phone.
A senior developer
woman in your
Calvin had
situation.
pushed aside when
I
she'd
thought
asked
about
for
the hospital
accommodation
bill.
after a cancer
About
diagnosis.
3 other people he'd hurt
She'd
the
stayed
same way.
with the company out
Set
of
up a
necessity.
meeting.
I
But she
want to
hated
explore
Calvin.
options. That
He
night,
told me to
I lay
consider
awake
early
while my
retirement,
husband slept,
she
and my
said
daughter
when we met for
dozed in her
coffee.
bassinet.
Made it
The
clear I
numbers
was
ran through my
past
head.
my prime contribution
32%.
years.
35%.
I was 43,
3%.
Second was James.
The gap between
a
being
project
powerless
manager
and
Calvin
having
had
control.
demoted for
I'd
refusing
spent
to
my
lie
whole
about
career being the
timeline
good
projections.
employee. Following rules. Being grateful for opportunities. Accepting whatever was given. Maybe it was time to take instead. I sat in my
He
living
wanted
room,
me to
my
tell
3-week-old
clients we could
daughter
deliver
sleeping
in half
against
the
my
time.
chest. James
When the
explained.
email arrived,
When I said
the
that was
subject line was
impossible,
corporate neutral.
he called me
Benefits
uncommitted.
update.
Gave my
Important
job to
information.
someone younger who'd
My
say
hands were
whatever he
still
wanted.
shaky from
They both
exhaustion
had
and
hormones as
documentation.
I opened it.
Emails.
The message was
Performance
sterile,
reviews that
bureaucratic,
contradicted
designed
Calvin's
to
public
obscure its
statements.
cruelty behind
Evidence of a
professional
pattern.
language.
Due
Together
to
we
recent
built the
budget
file.
adjustments,
Not
your
for
health insurance
revenge,
coverage has been
for
paused
protection,
indefinitely.
for proof.
Effective
My advisor
immediately.
called that evening.
This decision
Tessa,
reflects
you're
our
at
commitment to
48%.
fiscal responsibility
We're getting
during
close.
challenging economic
How
times.
close to majority?
I read it 3 times
3%.
before the words
But
actually
that's going to
penetrated.
require serious
Paused indefinitely.
Can
My
you
health
make it
insurance.
happen? While
If
I was
you're
on maternity
absolutely
leave,
certain,
while I had
I'm
a newborn
certain.
whose
I
hospital
planted
bills
the
were due
seed
next
carefully.
week.
The
During a
sender
meeting
wasn't
about
HR.
Q4 planning,
It was a
I
direct
mentioned the
message
upcoming
from
audit.
Calvin Rees, my
Shouldn't we
boss.
do a routine
He'd
audit
made this
before
decision
year-end?
personally.
I suggested
My daughter
innocently,
stirred against me
to make sure
making
everything's
small
clean
whimpering
for the
sounds.
board review.
I held her
Calvin
closer,
jumped on it,
feeling the weight
Excellent
of her tiny
idea,
body.
Tessa.
The
Shows we're
vulnerability of her
transparent.
existence.
Proactive.
The hospital bill
He thought
sitting
it would
on my
make him
desk
look
was
good.
$14,000.
Thought an audit would just
My
rubber
husband's
stamp his
insurance
cost
wouldn't
cutting
cover it.
genius.
We'd
He
relied
had
on
no
mine
idea
for the
what the
pregnancy.
auditors would find.
He
The
really
audit
thinks he
began
can get
2
away
weeks
with
later.
this.
I
I'd
whispered.
quietly tipped
Right
off
then,
the auditing
something
firm
hardened
about
inside
specific
me.
areas
A
to
decision.
examine.
Promise.
The irregular transfers.
He would never have this kind
the
of power
performance
over me
bonuses
again.
that coincided
I called
with
Calvin the
insurance
next morning.
cuts.
The shell
Keeping my
company
voice
buying
steady
shares.
despite the rage
3
burning in
days
my
into
chest.
the audit,
My daughter
lead
was in her
auditor
bassinet
requested
beside
a meeting
me,
with the company
sleeping
chair.
peacefully.
We found
Unaware
some
that her mother was about to
discrepancies
confront
that
the man
require
who just
immediate
made our
attention.
lives
The
infinitely
chair
harder.
scheduled an emergency
Tessa,
board review
how's
for the
motherhood
following
treating
Monday.
you?
Calvin
His voice
was
too
nervous.
cheerful, too
I
casual.
could see it in how
Like
he
he
paced
hadn't
his
just
office,
stripped away my
how he
family's
snapped at
healthcare.
his assistant.
I received
how
the
he
email
kept checking
about
his
my
phone.
insurance.
It's just
Yes.
routine. Unfortunate
I told him
timing
when he
but
vented to me.
necessary. I'm
We're
sure
making tough
everything's
choices
fine.
across the board.
He looked at me
He
with
paused.
something like suspicion.
Between you and
and me.
Why are you
A woman
being
in
so
your situation
supportive?
might want to
Because you're
reconsider her
right.
workload anyway.
Sentiment is
Focus
expensive.
on family.
And I'm
Maybe
learning to think
transition
like
to
you do.
part-time when you
The
return.
lie was so smooth
The
it scared
condescension
me.
was breathtaking.
Calvin's counterattack
A woman
came
in your
fast.
situation.
He called
As
me
if
into
having
his
a
office
child
3
made me
days
less
before the
capable,
board review.
less valuable.
Tessa, I've been
I see,
reviewing
I
performance
said
metrics.
quietly. Glad you
output
understand.
since returning from
These
leave
decisions aren't personal, Tessa.
disappointing.
Just business.
I've completed every
I hung up and
project
sat
you
there,
assigned.
trembling,
Barely.
not from fear,
And with significant
from clarity,
quality issues.
the kind that comes
He
when
slid a
someone
folder
shows you
across his
exactly who
desk.
they are.
I walked to
formally
my home
documenting
office
your
and
poor
opened the filing
performance.
cabinet.
Effective
Inside was a
immediately.
folder I
You're being
hadn't touched in
demoted to
months.
junior analyst.
My father's old
The demotion
investment
was
portfolio.
public. The trust
Humiliating.
account he'd left
Designed to
me.
destroy
I pulled it
my
out and
credibility
started reading.
before the board review.
3 years earlier,
But I'd
my
been
father had
expecting
died
this.
suddenly.
Planned for
Heart
it
attack.
even.
He was
understand,
only 62,
I said calmly.
At his funeral,
Don't you want to fight
his
this?
lawyer had handed me an
Object.
envelope.
Would it matter?
Inside was a
He
letter
smiled.
in my father's
No,
handwriting.
not really.
Tessa,
That
don't waste
afternoon,
this.
I forwarded
something
every
of your
piece
own.
of evidence I'd
Security
collected to my
isn't a
attorney.
job, it's
the
ownership.
insurance cancellations.
Be smart.
The forced
inheritance
resignations.
was modest.
The financial
$60,000.
irregularities.
The
Not
shell
enough
company.
to retire on,
The
but
secretly
enough to
recorded
invest wisely.
meetings.
My
Then I
father
waited.
had always been
The board
interested
review
in our
was
company.
tense.
12
He'd
board
researched
members
it, knew
sat
its
around a long
trajectory.
table.
That company
Calvin
you
stood
work
at the
for,
front,
he'd told
confident
me once.
despite the
It's
audit
undervalued.
findings.
These
Management's
so-called
weak,
discrepancies
but the fundamentals
are
are
accounting
solid.
errors.
If I were younger,
Misunderstandings
I'd
of
buy
how
in.
performance
So I'd
bonuses are
honored his
allocated.
advice. His voice
Used
was
my
smooth,
maiden name,
practiced.
Tessa
The real
Morrison
story
instead
is
of
cost
Tessa Kent.
savings.
To set up a trust.
Efficiency.
Bought
Leadership
shares
that
quietly
makes
through
hard
a
choices.
financial advisor
He
my
blamed
father had
lazy
recommended.
employees. Started Market
with
conditions.
5% ownership.
Economic headwinds.
Over 3 years,
Everything
I'd
except
reinvested
his own
dividends.
decisions.
Bought during
I sat
dips,
at the end of the
accumulated
table,
slowly.
silent.
It was supposed to be my safety
The board
net.
asked questions.
My retirement
Calvin
fund.
deflected
My
smoothly.
insurance against
The
exactly
auditors
the kind of
presented their
situation I
findings.
was now facing.
But Calvin spun
I'd
them
never
as
imagined
positive
it might
indicators
become
of his
something
bold
else.
leadership.
Something
Then
bigger.
the chair cleared
Leverage.
his throat.
While I was at
Before
home
we make any
recovering,
decisions,
the
I need to
company's inner
ask,
circle was busy.
Are there any
I
significant
knew this
changes
because
to our
I still
shareholder
had
structure?
access to the
Any
company's
new
shared
majority
calendar.
stakeholders
I could see
we
the
should be
meetings.
aware of.
The private
The room went
discussions
quiet.
Calvin was scheduling.
Calvin smiled
One
slightly.
meeting title
He'd
caught
been
my
buying
attention.
shares too.
Leadership
Thought he had
transition
this locked
planning.
down.
I called
stayed
my friend
silent.
Keisha,
Not
who
yet.
still worked in the
Not
office.
quite yet.
What's
We'll
happening
defer
with the
final
leadership
judgment
transition
until the shareholder
Girl,
meeting
you
next
didn't
month.
hear.
The chair
Calvin's
announced.
basically
At
guaranteed
which
the
point
CO
all
position.
major shareholders will have
He's
a voice.
been strutting around
As we filed
like he
out,
already
Calvin
has it.
grabbed my arm.
Why?
You look satisfied.
He's been cutting costs
Why?
like crazy.
No reason,
Convinced
I
the
replied.
board he's a
Just
financial
glad to see
genius.
transparent
Cancelled
leadership in
insurance
action.
for you and 2
The
other
anonymous
people on
letter
leave.
arrived at
Pushed
HR
out
on a
3
Wednesday.
senior employees
Detailed.
by making their jobs
Documented.
impossible.
Impossible
the board
to ignore.
thinks he's brilliant.
It outlined everything.
My stomach turned.
The insurance cancellations.
He cancelled insurance
the forced
for others
resignations.
too. Yeah.
The financial
Marcus in
irregularities.
accounting and Sylvia in sales.
Evidence.
Both out on medical
HR
leave.
had no choice but to investigate.
He called it
Calvin
eliminating
launched a
redundant
witch hunt.
coverage costs.
Desperate to find
After
the
I hung up,
source.
I sat
in
in
a staff
silence.
meeting. He pointed
This
at
wasn't
me.
just about
This
me.
has your fingerprints
Calvin was
all over it,
systematically
Tessa.
hurting people
Bitter
to boost
about
his
your
own
performance
career.
review,
using our
trying
pain
to
as proof
sabotage
of his
me.
leadership.
Everyone stared.
I opened my laptop
The room
and
was
logged into
dead
my trust
silent.
account.
I stood
Time
slowly.
to see exactly what I
Calvin,
had.
I've been nothing
the
but
hospital bill
supportive of
arrived
your
2
leadership.
days later.
If there's evidence of wrongdoing, I'm sure you'll be
$347.
cleared.
True in
Truth
30
always
days
comes out.
I stared
Then
at
I
the number
smiled.
until it blurred.
You'll regret that
My husband's
accusation.
salary was good.
He blanched.
But we'd budgeted
Something in my
based on
tone
2
finally
incomes.
made him nervous.
Based on having
Calvin's
insurance.
attorney sent me a letter
14,000
threatening to
would
sue
wipe
for
out most of
defamation.
our emergency
My
fund.
attorney responded with a
humiliation
letter
was
of his
crushing.
own. I'd
Our
worked at that
client
company
holds a
for 6
substantial
years.
stake in the
Given
company.
them everything.
Any legal
Stayed
action
late.
against her will
Took
be
on
viewed
extra
as
projects.
harassment of a major
Mentored
shareholder.
junior employees.
We advise
and
you this
to
was how they
reconsider.
repaid loyalty.
The phrase,
but as I held that
stake,
bill,
was carefully
something
chosen.
shifted. Enough
pain
to worry
transformed
Calvin
into something
but not
harder.
enough to reveal
Clearer.
the full extent
No
of my
emotional
ownership.
outburst.
Calvin
No
called the board
confrontation.
chair,
No
demanding I be
complaints.
fired
Just
immediately.
strategy.
The
I
chair
called my
refused.
financial advisor.
We need to handle
the one
this
my father
carefully.
had recommended.
If she's a significant
the one who
shareholder,
managed my trust.
this could trigger
Tessa,
legal
good
issues.
to hear from you.
How's
significant?
the baby?
Beautiful.
I don't know yet,
but I need to
but
talk about my
significant
portfolio.
enough that her attorney
How much
is
do
confident.
I actually own?
Calvin started
Let me
making
pull up
calls, your
trying to
account.
find out how
Heard
much I
typing.
owned.
But
Then
my
a low
shares
whistle.
were held in a
With the
trust under my
reinvestments
maiden
and
name,
the additional
not
purchases we
connected
made
to my
last
employee
quarter.
records.
You're
He
at
couldn't find me
32%
in
of
the
shareholder
company's
registry.
outstanding shares,
and that terrified him.
32%.
The chair
I
requested
requested a private meeting with me, but hearing the number at a coffee shop made it real. From the office. Who else owns significant shares? I need to ask you directly. The largest shareholder of the company is an investment fund that backs Calvin my portfolio statement. They own 35%. Slid it across the table. I was 3% away from matching Calvin's biggest 48%. Supporter. My advisor continued, and I'm not done buying. Why
Tessa,
are you doing
you
this?
realize what this
I
means.
told him everything.
You're one of the
largest
largest
individual
individual
shareholders.
The hospital bills.
If you kept buying,
the systematic
I could
cruelty
own the
Calvin
company
had
he
shown
thinks
to
he
people on
runs.
leave.
Theoretically,
The evidence
yes,
of financial
but that would
irregularities
require significant
I'm
capital.
not doing this for
More
revenge,
than you
I
currently
said.
have liquid.
I'm doing this
What if I
because
used
someone
my
needs
home
to stop
equity?
him.
And
And
the
took out a
board
loan
hasn't.
against my
He
current
studied
shares.
me for a long moment.
Silence. You
Then,
realize what
that's
this
risky.
means. If the
you
company's
hit
value
51%,
dropped, you could lose
I'll
everything.
be the majority
I
shareholder.
thought about Calvin's
Yes,
voice on the phone.
you could restructure
a woman in
everything.
your situation.
Fire Calvin.
I thought about the hospital
Change
bill.
policies.
About 3
That's
other people
exactly
he'd heard
what
the
I
same
planned
way.
to do.
Set
He
up a
leaned
meeting.
back.
I want
The
to
shareholder
explore
meeting
options.
is in 3 weeks.
That night,
If you
I
can
lay
get to
awake while my
majority by
husband
then,
slept and my daughter
I
dozed
will.
in her bassinet.
My advisor called
the
2
numbers
days
ran
later.
through my head.
We found
32%,
a small
35%
fund that's willing to divest.
3%.
It's exactly
the gap
what
between
you
being
need.
powerless
How
and having
much?
control.
3%
of
my whole
outstanding
career being the
shares.
good employee.
But it's expensive.
Following rules.
You'd need
Being
to
grateful
leverage
for
everything.
opportunities.
I thought about my
Accepting
daughter
whatever was
sleeping in her
given.
crib. Maybe it was
About the
time to take
hospital bill
instead.
I'd
paid from our emergency fund. About every person Calvin had hurt. Do it. The transaction took a week to finalize. Legal reviews. Regulatory approvals. Transfer of funds that made my hands shake when I signed the authorization. But when it was done, my advisor sent a simple text. 51%. I was the majority shareholder. I sat in my living room, my 3-week-old daughter
Calvin
sleeping against
his.
my chest. The annual
When the
meeting
email
was
arrived,
Friday. The subject
Calvin
line
still
was
thought it
corporate
was his
neutral.
victory lap.
Benefits
His
update.
coronation
Important
essay.
information.
He had no idea what
my
was
hands
coming.
were still shaky
The night
from
before the
exhaustion
meeting,
and
I
hormones
sat in
as
my
I
daughter's
opened it.
nursery.
The message
Feeding
was
her in
sterile,
the quiet
bureaucratic.
darkness. She
Designed
looked
to
up at me
obscure
with
its
those
cruelty
huge eyes,
behind professional
trusting
language.
completely.
Due to recent
He
budget
took things
adjustments
from us,
your health
I
insurance
whispered.
coverage has
My
been
health
paused
coverage,
indefinitely.
our security,
effective
my
immediately.
dignity.
This
But I'm
decision
taking
reflects
back
our
everything,
commitment to
not
fiscal
for revenge,
responsibility during
because it's
challenging
right.
economic times.
I thought about my
I read it
father's
3
letter.
times before
Build
the words
something of
actually
your own.
penetrated.
Security
Paused
is indefinitely.
indefinitely. Its ownership.
My health insurance.
He'd been right.
While I was on
and now I
maternity
understood.
leave.
While I had a
placed my
newborn
ownership
whose hospital
documents
bills
in a
were due
leather
next
folder.
week. Labeled
The sender
it simply,
wasn't
HR.
Reinstatement.
It was a direct message
Tomorrow,
from Calvin
everything would
Reese, my
change.
boss. The boardroom
He'd
was
made this
packed.
decision
All
personally.
12 board members.
My daughter stirred
senior
against
executives,
me, making small
major
whimpering
department
sounds.
heads. I held her
Calvin,
closer, sitting at the
feeling
head of
the
the
weight
table,
of her tiny
beaming.
body.
Thank
The
you all for
vulnerability
coming,
of her
he began.
existence.
The
Today
hospital
marks
bill
a
sitting
turning
on my
point
desk
for this
was
company.
$14,000.
Under my leadership,
my
as
husband's
incoming
insurance
COO,
wouldn't cover it.
The chair
We'd relied
interrupted.
on mine for the
Before
pregnancy.
we proceed, Calvin,
He
we have a
really thinks he can
procedural
get
matter.
away with this.
Our new
I
majority
whispered.
shareholder
Right then,
has requested
something
time
hardened
to
inside
address
me.
the board.
A decision.
Calvin's smile
Promise.
faltered.
He would never
Majority
have this kind of power
shareholder.
over me again.
Who?
I called
Every eye
Calvin
in
the
the
next
room
morning,
turned
toward me
keeping
as I
my
stood.
voice steady
That
despite
would
the
be
rage
me.
burning in my
The
chest.
silence was
My
absolute.
daughter was in her bassinet
Calvin's
beside
face
me,
went white.
sleeping peacefully.
I opened my folder
unaware that
and
her mother
began
was about to
distributing
confront the
copies
man
of
who
my
just made our
documentation.
lives infinitely
Ownership
harder.
papers showing
Tessa,
51%.
how's motherhood treating
Evidence
you?
of the insurance
His voice was too
cancellations.
cheerful, too
The
casual.
forced resignations.
Like he hadn't just stripped
the
away my
financial
family's
irregularities.
healthcare.
I received
Over the past
the
3
email
years,
about my
I said
insurance.
calmly.
I've been
yes,
acquiring shares in
unfortunate
this
timing,
company,
but necessary.
As of last week,
we're making
I
tough
hold
choices
majority
across
ownership.
the board.
Calvin
He
tried
paused.
to speak.
Between you
No
and
words
me,
came out.
a woman in your
And
situation
as majority
might want to
owner,
reconsider her
I'm
workload
exercising my
anyway.
right to make
Focus on
immediate
family.
changes to company
Maybe
leadership
transition
and
to
policy.
part-time when
I
you
walked them
return.
through everything.
The condescension
The insurance
was
cancellations that had
a woman
hurt
in
4
your
employees,
situation,
including
as if
me.
having a
The
child
forced
made me less
resignations
capable,
Calvin
less
had
valuable.
orchestrated.
I see.
The performance
I said
bonuses
quietly.
he paid himself
Glad you
using money
understand.
saved from cutting
These
benefits.
decisions aren't
Gasps
personal,
rippled
Tessa.
through the room.
Just business.
Some board members
I hung up
already
and
knew
sat
pieces
there
of
trembling.
this. But
Not
seeing
from
it
fear,
altogether was
from
damning.
clarity. The audit
kind
found
that
comes when someone
irregularities
shows you
because there were
exactly who they are.
irregularities.
I walked to my
Calvin
home
has been
office and opened the
systematically
filing
exploiting
cabinet.
vulnerable employees
Inside was
to
a
boost
folder
his
I
own
hadn't
career
touched
and
in months.
compensation.
My
Calvin's
father's old
found his
investment
voice.
portfolio.
This is
the trust
slander.
account he'd
I
left
made
me.
tough choices
I pulled it
for the
out and
company's
started
financial
reading.
health.
3 years
You made
earlier,
choices
my
that
father
were
had
cruel
died
and
suddenly.
possibly illegal.
Heart attack.
And you did
He
it
was
for
only
personal
62.
gain. I pulled
At
out
his
the
funeral,
final document.
His lawyer had
Effective
handed me an
immediately.
envelope.
I'm removing
Inside
Calvin
was a
Reese
letter
from all
in my
leadership
father's
positions.
handwriting.
He's
Tessa, terminate
don't waste this.
To cut costs.
Build something of
The
your
words
own.
landed like a bomb.
Security isn't a
Several
job,
people
it's
smiled
ownership.
despite
Be
themselves.
smart.
Calvin's
The inheritance
face went
was
from white
modest.
to red.
$60,000, he shouted.
Not enough to retire
I'm the majority
on, but enough
shareholder.
to invest wisely.
I absolutely
My father
can.
had always been interested in our
HR.
company.
Please
He'd
research
researched
Mr.
it, knew
Reese
its
from the
trajectory.
building.
Security
That company
will
you
meet
work
him
for,
at his office.
he told me once.
Security appeared
It's
at the door.
undervalued.
Calvin
Management's
looked around
weak,
wildly,
but the fundamentals
seeking
are solid.
allies.
Finding
If I were
none.
younger,
As
I'd
Calvin
buy in.
was escorted out,
So I'd honored
the room
his
erupted
advice.
in whispered
Used my
conversations.
maiden name.
The chair
Tessa
called
Morrison
for order.
instead of Tessa
What are
Kent.
your
To
intentions
set up a
for the
trust?
company? He
Bought
asked
shares
me.
quietly through a
Immediate
financial
reinstatement
advisor
of
my
health
father
coverage
had
for all
recommended.
employees on
Started
leave.
with 5%
Full
investigation
ownership.
into
Over
forced
3 years,
resignations
I'd
with
reinvested
restitution where
dividends.
appropriate.
Bought during
New
dips,
policies
accumulated
protecting
slowly.
employees during
It was
medical
supposed to
and
be my
family
safety
leave.
net.
And
My
a complete
retirement
review
fund.
of executive
My
compensation
insurance against
tied to
exactly
employee
the kind of
welfare
situation I
metrics.
was now facing.
I looked around the room.
I'd never imagined
This
it
company
might
will
become
put people
something else.
first. Something
Or I'll
bigger.
find leadership
Leverage.
that will.
While I
The
was
board
at home
voted
recovering,
unanimously
the
to
company's
approve my
inner
proposals.
circle was busy.
That afternoon,
I knew this
HR
because I
sent
still had
messages
access
to everyone
the
whose
company's
insurance
shared
Calvin
calendar.
had cancelled.
I could see the meetings,
Coverage reinstated
the private
immediately.
discussions Calvin
The
was
company would
scheduling.
cover all
One
medical
meeting
bills
title caught
incurred
my
during
attention.
the gap.
Leadership
Patricia cried
transition
when she got
planning.
the news.
I called my
James
friend
called to
Keisha,
thank me.
who still worked
Even
in the
people I
office.
barely knew
What's
stopped by
happening
my
with the
office
leadership
to express
transition?
gratitude.
Girl,
But the
you
moment
didn't
that mattered
hear.
most came an
Calvin's
hour
basically
later.
guaranteed
To knock
the
on my
CO
door.
position.
Calvin, escorted
He's been
by
strutting
security,
around like he
asking
already
to
has
speak
it.
privately.
Why?
We stood in the hallway.
He's been cutting
Calvin
costs
flanked
like
by
crazy.
security guards.
Convinced the
He
board
looks smaller
he's a financial
somehow.
genius.
Defeated. Cancelled
Please,
insurance
he
for
said
you and
quietly.
2 other people on
Give
leave.
me another chance.
Pushed out 3
Can
senior
change.
employees
I
by
can
making
be
their
better.
jobs impossible.
I looked at him
the
for a
board
long
thinks
moment.
he's brilliant.
Remembered his
My
voice
stomach
on the
turned.
phone.
A woman in your
He cancelled
situation.
insurance for
Remembered
others
the
too.
hospital bill.
Yeah.
The
Marcus in
humiliation,
accounting and
the
Sylvia
fear.
in sales.
You taught me
Both
something,
out on
Calvin,
medical leave.
I said.
Never
He called it
underestimate who you
eliminating
step on,
redundant
because
coverage
they might be the
costs.
ones who
After I
end
hung
up
up,
standing
I
above
sat in
you.
silence.
Tessa, please.
This wasn't just about
Goodbye,
me,
Calvin.
Calvin was
I walked
systematically
away,
hurting
leaving
him in
people
that
to
hallway.
boost his own career.
Walked through the office
Using our
where people
pain
looked
as
at
proof
me
of
with
his
new
leadership.
respect.
I
Walked
opened my
past
laptop
my old
and logged
closet
into my
office
trust
to the
account.
corner office that
Time
was
to
now
see
mine.
exactly what
Called
I
my
had.
husband.
The hospital
It's
bill
done.
arrived 2 days
How do you
later.
feel?
$14,000. My daughter cooed in the
$347.
background.
Due
I could
in
hear
30
her through the
days.
phone.
I stared at the number
baby
until
sound
it
that
blurred.
meant everything was
My
right in her
husband's
world.
salary was good.
We're okay
but
now,
we
I
budgeted
told
based
him.
on 2
We're
incomes.
more than okay.
Based on having
That
insurance.
evening, I stood in my new
14,000
office
would
and
wipe
looked
out
at the
most
wall
of
where
our
Calvin's
emergency fund.
motivational
The
posters
humiliation was
I'd
crushing.
had them replaced
I'd
with
worked at
something
that company
simple.
for 6
A
years.
new company motto,
Given them
printed
everything.
in elegant
Stayed
letters.
late. Took on
People
extra
first.
projects.
Not revenge.
Mentored junior
not
employees.
cruelty. And
Just
this was
the
how they
simple
repaid
principle that
loyalty.
treating people with
But as I
dignity
held
wasn't
that
sentiment.
bill, something
It
shifted.
was good business.
The pain
My
transformed
father had
into
told me to
something
build
harder,
something of my
clearer.
own.
No
I built
emotional
more than
outburst.
security, no
Built
confrontation,
justice.
and
No
it felt
complaints.
perfect. Just strategy. I called my financial advisor, the one my father had recommended, the one who managed my trust. Tessa, good to hear from you. How's the baby? Beautiful. But I need to talk about my portfolio. How much do I actually own? Let me pull up your account. Heard typing. Then a low whistle. With the reinvestments and the additional purchases we made last quarter, you're at 32% of the company's outstanding shares. 32%. I'd known it was substantial, but hearing the number said aloud made it real. Who else owns significant shares? The largest shareholder is an investment fund that backs Calvin Reese. They own 35%. I was 3% away from matching Calvin's biggest supporter. My advisor continued, his voice thoughtful. Tessa, you realize what this means. You're one of the largest individual shareholders. If you kept buying, I could own the company he thinks he runs. Theoretically, yes. But that would require significant capital. More than you currently have liquid. What if I used my home equity? Or took out a loan against my current shares? Silence. Then, that's risky. If the company's value dropped, you could lose everything. I thought about Calvin's voice on the phone. A woman in your situation. I thought about the hospital bill. About 3 other people he'd hurt the same way. Set up a meeting. I want to explore options. That night, I lay awake while my husband slept and my daughter dozed in her bassinet. The numbers ran through my head. 32%.
35%. 3%. The gap between being powerless and having control. I'd spent my whole career being the good employee, following rules, being grateful for opportunities, accepting whatever was given. Maybe it was time to take instead.